Okay, let's start with the bell ringer on Wednesday, 11/8/2017. Your answer should have already been written on the paper. This is just us going over it. So determine if each relation below is a function or not a function. Well, number one, if you look at your input, which is also known as your x, and your output is your y. If you look at your x and you notice that all of your inputs are different, and let's see, they're all different. So because this is a mapping, we're going to look and see and make sure that each input goes to only one output. Well, I see that 0 is going to 2, -2, and 0 is going to 1. So that means that this input has more than one output. So this automatically makes number one not a function. And number two. With a graph, we have to do the vertical line test. So if you were to draw a vertical line on this graph, would it go through more than 1 point? Well, in this case, it's going through more than 2 points because this would be a point and this would be a point. So that makes this not a function as well, because it did not pass the vertical line test. Number two. So we need to make sure that we check our x's and to see if they're different. Well, this is x, this is an x, and this is an x, and they're all the same. So that means that if all of my x's are the same, that means all of the y's would have to be exactly the same too, but they're not. So this makes this not a function either. So all three of these questions are not a function. Okay, so our objective today is I can write an equation from a graph, table, or set of ordered pairs. Now this is something that we've already done, but I wanted to review it again because it's going to be on this test as well. So this is something that we need to be able to do well before we move on to the next module. Our sub-objective is to find slope on a graph. So obviously we need to be able to find our rise over our run. We need to use the slope formula to find slope, which is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And we also need to be able to identify the y-intercept. Remember, the y-intercept is where your graph line crosses the y-axis. In this case, it would be 0. Or if it's in a table, your ordered pairs, your x would be 0. So in this case, 0, 0. 0 would be the ordered pair. Or in this case, if you had 0, 7, 7 would be your y-intercept. Okay, so anytime x is 0, its y is going to be the y-intercept. Okay, so writing equations from tables and graphs. This is a packet that you should have picked up from the substitute. If you're in 5th or 6th period, if you're in 1st and 4th, you should already have this packet. Okay, so slope-intercept form. We need two pieces of information in order to write the equation of a linear function. And the first thing you need is the slope, or m. M stands for slope. The second thing you need is your y-intercept, which is b. And once you have these two values, we will write an equation in the form of y equals mx plus b. And remember, m stands for slope and b is your y-intercept. So when we're looking at a table, from a table we can find the slope by calculating the slope formula by using the formula y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And then you're going to look for the y-intercept as the value of y, where the x value is equal to 0. So if you have a table And if you were to see 0, 1 as an ordered pair, you know that 1 you would list as your y-intercept. Okay? So from a graph, we can find the slope by setting up a ratio of your rise over your run. Okay? Also, it's called your change of y over your change of x. Remember, you always put your y over your x. So we're going to look for the y-intercept as the point where the graph crosses the y-axis. So just like if you have a graph, wherever it crosses is going to be your y-axis. So that point right there would be your y-axis. I'm sorry, your y-intercept, because it's crossing on the y-axis. Okay, so let's look at number 1. It says Luke's family goes to the movies and purchases a large popcorn. They are debating whether or not to purchase any drinks. The table below shows how much they'll spend based on the number of drinks they decide to purchase. Okay, what we know is that they've gone to the movies and they've already purchased a large popcorn. And they're debating on whether to purchase any drinks. So the table below shows how much they'll spend based on the number of drinks they decide to purchase. So this table is based off of the number of drinks they're deciding to purchase. Well, the number of drinks is going to be your x, and your total cost is y. Y is always going to be your total cost. So how do we find slope? Well, we're going to use our slope formula, which is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So we're going to pick 2 points. I've got 2 points picked out here, 0 and $6.25 and 1 and $10. So I'm going to label this x1, y1, x2, y2. So I have y2 minus y1. So y2 is 10 minus y1 was just $6.25 over x2, which is 1, minus x1, which is 0. Well, 10 minus 6.25 gives you 3.75 over 1 minus 0 is 1. So the question says, what is slope? Well, it is 375. What is the y-intercept? Well, the y-intercept is where my x has a 0 and its companion y is the y-intercept. So if we erase this and we look for x is 0, which is right here, this makes $6.25 is my y-intercept. Because if I were to plot this point, it would lie on the y-axis, 6.25. So my equation is going to be y equals 375 x plus 6.25. Okay? So, the next question is, what does the slope represent in the situation? Well, slope represents the cost per drink. And you know that because your table is telling you that you're looking at the number of drinks and the total cost. So we know that the slope formula told us that our total cost is $3.75 for one drink, because this is the change of y over the change of x. Well, so y is your total cost, and x is the number of drinks. So for one drink, we pay $3.75. So what does the y-intercept represent in the situation? The y-intercept represents the cost of the popcorn, because they already purchased popcorn. It told us that they purchased a large popcorn. So the cost of the popcorn. So we're adding a drink to the cost of each popcorn. Okay, so let's look at number 2. It says Betty's Bakery uses chocolate chip cookie recipe that calls for a certain ratio of brown sugar to butter as shown in the graph. So we're looking at the graph, and looks like my X is going to be butter in cups, and my Y is going to be brown sugar in cups. And I need to find the slope, the y-intercept. I need to write an equation, and then I need to tell what the slope represents in the situation and what the y-intercept represents in the situation. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick 2 points, and I see that 2 points are already picked for me. So I have a point here and a point here. So now I'm going to do my change of y, which is my rise, over my change of x, which is my run. And I'm going to count my y. So I'm counting up 1, 2, 3. So my change of y, or my run, my rise is 3. My run is 1, 2, 3, 4, which is my change of x. So that means that my slope is going to be 3 over 4. What is the y-intercept? Well, the y-intercept is where the line crosses the y-axis. So the line is crossing the y-axis right here, because we're only given the first quadrant. So this is the y-axis, and it's at 0. So my y-intercept is 0. What is my equation? Well, my equation is y equals my slope, which is 3/4, and I always attach x to it. And I'm going to leave off my y-intercept because it's 0 this time. So my equation would be y equals 3/4 x. So what does the slope represent in this situation? Well, the recipe uses 3 cups of brown sugar, for every 4 cups of butter. And the reason how I read that is I know that 3 is my y, and my y is brown sugar, and 4 is my x, and it's butter. So for every 3 cups of brown sugar, the recipe uses 3 cups of brown sugar for every 4 cups of butter. And what does the y represent in the situation? Well, the y-intercept is 0. So basically, the recipe uses 0 cups of brown sugar for 0 cups of butter. So the recipe uses 0 cups of brown sugar for 0 cups of butter. Basically, if you're not making a recipe, you're not using any brown sugar or any butter. That's why it's 0. Okay, so let's look at number 3. A plane uses a certain amount of fuel based on the number of miles it travels as shown in the table. So we're given a table, and we're given miles traveled in gallons of fuel. So I'm going to say that miles traveled is going to be my x, and gallons of fuel is going to be my y. I need to find the slope, the y-intercept, and write an equation. I also need to know what slope represents and what the y-intercept represents. So a plane uses a certain amount of fuel based on the number of miles it travels as shown in the table. Okay, so I need to use my slope formula to find my slope here. So I'm going to write my slope formula down here, y2, minus y1 over x2 minus x1. I'm going to pick out 2 points. Here's a point, and here's a point. I'm going to label my points. This would be x1, this would be y1. This would be x2, this would be y2. So y2 is 156 minus 30 over 0. I'm sorry, let me erase that. I'm sorry, to be 156 minus 0 over 30 minus 0. So that means that my slope would be 156 over 30. And if I reduce 156 over 30, I'm going to get 5.2. So that means that my slope is 5.2. My y-intercept is going to be 0 because my x right here is 0. This x is 0. So its y is my y-intercept, and it just happens to be 0. It also makes sense because if you haven't traveled, then you obviously haven't used any gallons of fuel. So my equation is going to be y equals 5.2x. So what does slope represent in this situation? It represents the plane uses 5.2 gallons of fuel per mile. Okay, and what does the y-intercept represent in this situation? The y-intercept represents the it's 0, so basically the plane would use 0 miles of fuel to travel 0 miles. So the plane would use 0 gallons to travel 0 miles. Okay, and number 4, it says Robert pays for his family to go bowling. He rents shoes for everyone, and then he pays a certain amount per game that his family plays as shown in the graph. Okay, so I need to know what the slope is, I need to know what the y-intercept is, I need to write an equation, and once again I need to understand what slope represents and what the y-intercept represents. So I'm looking at my graph. Well, the number of games is x, and the total cost is y. Total cost will always be y in these equations. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pick 2 points. So I'm going to start right here at my y-intercept, which is at 0 and 12, and then I'm going to pick my second point, which is at 3 and 21. So I'm going to do my rise over my run. Well, my rise is going to be 9, and it's 9 because my y is being counted by 3s. So I'm going up 3, 6, 9. My x's are counting by 1, so I'm going over 2. So 9 over 2, and then if I reduce that, I get 4.5. So my slope is 4.5. Or in this case, because we're talking about money, it's going to be $4.50. My y-intercept, I've already established, is 12. Because this is where the line is going to cross the y-axis. If it continued on, it would cross the y-axis. So my equation is going to be y equals 4.5. I'm going to write this over here because I want to run out of room. Y equals 4.5x plus 12. That is my equation. Okay? And what does slope represent in the situation? Well, slope represents in the situation it costs $4.50 for each game of bowling. So slope represents the cost per game. What does the y-intercept represent? It represents the cost for shoes, because it costs $12 to rent shoes. Okay, so what you need to go ahead and work on your homework for writing equations with tables and graphs. And then when you're done with that, you can go back to, you can start your notes for writing equations from ordered pairs.